Welcome to Word Study with Jerry. We're going to be talking more on biblical covenants, but we're going to talk about the threshold covenant this time. And I do really hope you get a lot out of this lesson. I don't know how long it's going to be, but I do hope you'll stay around with us till the end. I really believe you'll get something good out of it. Okay, what is a threshold covenant? Let's read the scripture. Psalms 84 and 10. It says, "For a day in your courts is better than 1,000. I had rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of wickedness." Now, the word doorkeeper is the word saphath, as you'll see. It means to snatch away, that is, terminate. It comes from the word sath in the sense of a vestibule, to wait at the threshold. So he's saying here that King David was saying in this verse, I would rather wait at the threshold of God's house, or guard the threshold of God's house, than to dwell in the tents of wickedness. Because better is one day in God's house than 1,000 in the tents of the wicked. So what does snatching away in the sense of terminating here have to do with the threshold? I said that was one of the meanings of it. We're going to see what that is. The word for threshold is the Hebrew word soph. Now, I told you doorkeeper was the word saphath, but the word for threshold is the word soph. They basically go back to the same root word. One is just a noun, one is a verb, kind of an adjective maybe is more like it. But anyway, many scriptures were translated as door or basin, but it has to do with the threshold, and we're going to find out why that is so important. But first, we've got to understand what a threshold is. The word basin comes from the previous word saphath, but is soft. It means, in its original sense, as I said, of containing. A vestibule is a limit, a dish for holding blood or wine, a basin, a bowl, a cup, a door or a doorpost, gate or a gatepost, threshold. Now let's read this verse again and realize basin is threshold, or a bowl placed at the threshold. For a day in your courts is better than 1,000. I had rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of wickedness. So he'd rather be a watchman at the threshold of God's house than to dwell with the wicked. Okay, let's go to the next scripture, Exodus 12 and 22. And it says, "And you shall take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood that's in the basin, and strike the lintel and the two side posts with the blood that is in the basin, and none of you shall go out at the door of his house until the morning." Now, this word means in its original sense of containing, like a dish for holding blood or wine, a basin, a bowl, a cup, a doorpost, a gatepost, threshold. So what is happening here in the scripture is the children of Israel in Egypt, God is fixing to set them free. He's going to use Moses to do that. And God has told them to take some hyssop and to dip it in the blood and put it on the lintel of the door, which is the area above the door. And then the side post, or the two posts on the side of the door, that word is also known as mezuzah. Today, the Jewish people have a little thing they place on the side post, or the mezuzah itself, and they call it mezuzah, and that's because it's going on the side post. And he says, none of you should go out your door of your house until the morning. So this was a bowl, this was a dish that was there in the threshold of the door. And this is going to become more understandable as I go along, but this is really an awesome lesson. The threshold covenant is a powerful type and shadow, but the ancient practices of writing things on the lintel or above the door of the house was observed by a lot of nations and many people of the past and even in the present world. And as I said, the Jewish people make a little box that they call mezuzah and put it on their door, write scriptures from Deuteronomy on it and some others. I think there's 4 scriptures in there. But a lot of ancient peoples in the past would put incantations to their gods or something against the evil eye. And I mean, some of the stuff they did, when I read it, it's like kind of ridiculous to me. But they really totally believed in it. And the thing is that when God had the children of Israel to do something similar, like to making the box and putting on the doorpost, it was different in the sense that God required it, but God had a purpose, and it wasn't for an amulet or some kind of something to protect them. It was obedience to God. God told them to do this so they would remember His word, and when they saw that little box, they would remember to keep God's commandments and to do what He had said. And God never required anything that had to do with drinking blood, or pronouncing spells like the pagans did. His point was and is always unique. Most of the evidence of the secular world that you find concerning this covenant is so pagan and even occultic. But this was the norm for those living in biblical times. So they knew about the threshold covenant. God does use the things man's familiar with, and He's a part of the culture to give a picture or a type. Just make sure that anything you do for God, make sure that it is of God. It's not from pagan ideas. There's a lot of pagan ideas that have come into the church that I don't think God is pleased with. Not because God gave it because it's fun and people want to do it. But we don't do something because it's fun. We do something because God has told us to do it, or we don't do it because God has told us not to do it. Okay, and the next scripture that I want to go to, and also going to show you a picture here, and it is the threshold of a door that was discovered by archaeologists. And you can see in the center of this first big rock, that's called the foundation stone. In the very middle of it is a cutout that's kind of crooked, like a snake. But this was where they would do their sacrifices at the threshold of the door, and the blood would run into this middle part, and that's called the soft. It is in the threshold itself. It is in the foundation stone of the house. The threshold is the bottom part of your doors that people step over to enter into your home. When I taught on blood covenant, I told you about how that they would take the animals, they would cut them in halves, and they would dig a ditch, and the blood would flow into this ditch, and then they would walk through that ditch. In many cultures, ancient world, this was done at the threshold of the door. This is where the snatching away and the meaning to terminate come in, likely in reference to the sacrifice that they did there. And I believe that there's a possible type here of the snatching away of the bride of Christ, not for termination or not for terminating her, but for bringing her to her groom, because she cut covenant with Messiah. She stepped across that threshold to Him and came into covenant with Him, and He carries her to His threshold. And we're going to talk a little more about that as we go on. But in this picture, you can see the designation. The one side of that is the outside, which I believe is this bottom part. And then on the other side is the inside of what would have been the house. And on the left and right, you can see the stones that would have held the side post of the house. So really the door, all of the parts of the door depend upon this foundation stone to support them. But crossing over the threshold was a covenant process. And if visitors accepted this covenant, say if they went to someone's house, and they accepted it, they would step across the threshold. They would not step on it, because stepping on it was a sign of irreverence. It was a sign of insult. They were insulting them. They were turning away that the covenant that this family wanted to make with them, or the people in this house wanted to make them. And if they stepped on the threshold in that blood there, they were insulting them, and they were trampling on this covenant that they wanted them to make. So they would step across it into the house to accept the covenant. The threshold was a line between the outside and the inside. Those who came in the house by the threshold, they had the hospitality and the protection of the owners of the house, and they were in covenant with them. So to come in any other way meant you were a thief and possibly a murderer. And almost every single nation of the world knew what a threshold covenant was. In many areas, when an honored guest was coming and they knew it, they would kill on the threshold into the bowl-like cavity an animal according to however wealthy they were, depending on what animal they were according to their wealth. But if someone entered their house any other way, or tried to enter their house any other way than through the door, they knew their intent was not for good. So let's go to the next scripture, because this all reminds me of a scripture in the New Testament where Jesus said in John 10:1, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that enters not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbs up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber." They understood that to cross the threshold through the blood of that sacrifice was accepting covenant with the owner of the house. Now, to totally understand all this, we need to understand what the threshold stone was. It was understood to be the foundation stone of the house. We read about the foundation stone in Scripture, and somehow I think in our westernized minds we think it's something, a stone that the house sits upon, so the house is, got a good foundation. But that's not exactly what it is, not in a physical sense. But the foundation stone was the very first stone that would be laid, and it was the stone that would be the threshold. It would be what they would cross over into the house on. It was what the door sat on. It was the way into the house, and ancients would offer a sacrifice on this stone. It was like an altar for the house. And you could not enter that house unless you crossed that foundation stone. And if you crossed that foundation stone, it signified you were accepting the covenant, and you would get all the protection of that house. But these were some ancient stones that they found, which is believed to be a foundation stone that I'm going to show you in a picture just a minute. It's going to give you an idea of what the basin was in the Passover story. But first, I would like to say that when you see this picture, as about now, that you will notice that there is a line that designates two sides. And you see bowl-like structures here near the red and white piece of wood. And I believe that was probably the outside of the stone, and the line that kind of makes a straight line there was probably the inside. I could have it backwards, I don't really know. But this was a foundation stone. This was the soft, these bowls that you can see, these indentations were the soft, the threshold of the house. It was where that the sacrifices would be made there. So this gives you a good idea of what the basin was in the Passover story that we talked about a while ago. Now we're going to see another picture. And in this picture, you will see another foundation stone. And the bowl in the center of the threshold would be the saw, that little bowl-like area you see. And then below that, you see a mezuzah. What they look like today is what Israel places on their doorpost, on their lintels. It's called a mezuzah. And they use that name because that's actually what the side posts of the house are, the mezuzah. But you had to cross the threshold's foundation, as I said, to enter the house, and then you would be under the family's protection when you entered into covenant with them. Okay, we're going to go to, I can get this thing to work here, to another scripture. And it is Zephaniah 1:9. And it says, "And I shall punish on that day all who leap over the threshold, who fill their master's house with violence and deceit." And the interesting thing about this scripture, or this verse, is it says it fills their Adon's, or their Lord's house, with Hamas. That's the Hebrew word there, Hamas, and deceit. Hamas and deceit. If you know anything about or listen to the news at all today, there's a group over in the Middle East called Hamas, and they're a very violent, a very terrorist group. They are all the time doing bad stuff, really. They're very, very wicked. I guess you could use that word. There's terrorists. I don't know what other word to use for them, really. And they are deceitful. But Adon here means Lord or Master. And we all have a good example of Hamas, what Hamas is with this group called by that name today, because they are exactly what that name means biblically today. And it's translated as the word violence, and that's what they are. They're very, very violent. So that helps us kind of understand this verse again. To leap across that threshold meant covenant. Yet God said he would punish those who cut covenant with their Lord, but they fill his house with terrorism and deceit. We've had a lot of shootings and killings in churches, synagogues, places like that. That's God's house. And when someone comes across that threshold into God's house and they fill it with terrorism and deceit, he says here that God basically is letting us know here what he's going to do to them as we go on. But we're going to stop right there for just a little while, and then we're going to come back and finish this out.